Well, hello, everyone. My name's David Gallo. I'm the director of the AIFC Academy of Law, and we'd like to welcome all of you who have joined us today in this segment of our Legal Talks series. Now, Legal Talks has a special place for us here at AIFC. It is what it sounds like. It's generally two or more presenters. The format is somewhat informal. We sometimes call it a fireside chat, especially in the winter here in Kazakhstan. It makes us feel better to feel that we're somehow around a virtual fire. But this is a very special set of programs that we offer under the Legal Talks moniker, if you will, because it does tend to be a bit more informal, a bit more conversational. And we'd like you all to be part of that dynamic. So during the event itself, you can send chats to my colleague, Almas. He will be sending you prompts on that, but you see the chat function. You can write your questions, or when we get to Q&A, you can tap the hand icon to raise your hand to ask a question. Almas will call on each one of you one at a time. He'll activate your microphone, and you could directly ask one of our speakers the question. So when we get to the formal Q&A, we have those two options. And then during the event itself, I'm going to leave it to our speakers to kind of manage the event. If any of you have comments or questions during their presentation, you're free to go ahead and raise your hand and do that also. Okay, so by way of overview, the topic of today's event is transport law. What is it, and why become a transport lawyer? Well, transport lawyers deal with a wide range of matters, from the carriage of goods or people to the financing, construction, use, and insurance of movable assets. Though every one of us on this call and people generally depend on the smooth operation of the transport sector, because think about supply chain and the movement of virtually everything we eat, wear, touch, or use. It's somehow the transport sector was involved with bringing those products and services to you. Legislative schemes are changing to keep pace with economic growth. Well, think about it this way. International trade requires an efficient system of laws that are designed to streamline the cross-border flow of people, capital, and goods. And a new spirit of cooperation and collaboration is required to create a market-based legal infrastructure to support the development of the transport sector in Kazakhstan and across Central Asia. Well, today, we're pleased to invite two esteemed lawyers to share their experiences and day-to-day lives as transport lawyers, as well as to address some of the current issues in international trade. Paul Aston is a partner at the HFW law firm. Paul's based in Singapore. Paul has a very long and impressive CV. I'm going to give you a couple of highlights. Paul acts for clients in the maritime, offshore, and commodity sectors, primarily focused on oil and gas. He specializes in all aspects of shipping, transport and insurance, downstream and midstream oil and gas transactions, shipbuilding and repair disputes, advising shipyards and buyers on contracts for the construction of various offshore structures. Our other speaker today is Mr. Gerard Forlin, QC from Cornerstone Barristers, London. Gerard was called to the bar by Lincoln's Inn and appointed Queen's Counsel in 2010 in both the civil and criminal law sections. Gerard QC's broad practice covers civil, criminal, and commercial litigation, environment, fire, corporate governance, major event planning and crowd safety, crisis management, health and safety, aviation, inquests and inquiries, local authority governance and services, and regulatory law. Gerard has also published more than 100 articles and is the author of Corporate Liability, Work-Related Deaths, and Criminal Prosecutions. With that, Paul and Gerard. Nice to see both of you. Welcome to both of you. Nice to see you again. And we really appreciate your taking the time with us here today for the next hour. With that, let me turn the floor over to Paul and Gerard. And please, gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Well, David, thank you very much. And thank you very much to the Academy of Law and to the AIFC. It's an absolute pleasure. This is also quite a delight for Gerard and I, because we get to speak really on the hoof. That means we get to speak from our experience, not having to do so much work in preparation. But these are important matters. Before the format that we've adopted is I'm going to ask Gerard some leading questions to try and eke out of him some gems that he can give to us, and in return he's going to do the same for me, and then we'll take questions. But I want to start at the beginning and just explain that so far as the English legal system is concerned, and I'd ask you to note that the Anglo-Saxon, which is an old name for the common law system, does cover probably more than 1/3 of the world's jurisdictions and has influenced at least the American jurisdiction in some way. So basically, those countries that were part of what was the old British Empire still have essentially English common law and the Anglo-Saxon legal system. So for example, if Gerard and I were to look at the rules of the court in Malaysia or Australia or in Canada or wherever, they would probably be very similar to those that we have in England. And of course, the case law, if not authority, is persuasive. So English law has a huge impact, but particularly in mercantile law, which is trading, shipping, transportation, and also the projects to transport things. Gerard, of course, specializes particularly in aviation, but has also, as I'm going to try and get him to explain, had some very interesting rail matters. Now, before I go any further, I just want to make a very general point, which is often lost with young lawyers. Young lawyers think that M&A and corporate law is extremely sexy because you're more likely to earn a lot and it's very interesting. That may be true, but I ask you to look around you wherever you are, and I dare say that most of the things in the room or the building you are in may not actually have originated in Kazakhstan. Certainly where you live in a place like Singapore, almost everything is made of raw materials which have been imported into Singapore from somewhere else, or they are actually imported lock, stock and barrel. When you go to KL and you look at Petronas Towers, there's very little there that was made in Malaysia. So it had to get there somewhere. How did it get there? It got there on a ship or a train or an aircraft, occasionally by trucks, and now by pipeline. So transportation projects really affect people. I often wonder, living in a small island like Singapore, that people forget their maritime heritage. If it wasn't for their maritime heritage, Singapore wouldn't be the wonderful place it is. And there is at the moment a government policy to remind people of the wonderful maritime history and heritage of Singapore, and to teach children in schools that this just-in-time ability to be able to have tropical fruit, well, we live in the tropics, so we can have it all the time, but to have food from other places always available because of refrigeration and other things is not how it was like when Gerard and I were kids. Both of us were not brought up in England. Gerard was brought up in Singapore. I was brought up in East Africa. So we know what it's like to go back to England and not be able to have papaya or mango and only have, very bitter, horrible Granny Smith apples or whatever. Anyway, I digress. I just want you to understand, I don't think there is any project, construction project, be it road, be it port, be it bridges, be it building, anything that does not involve transportation, procurement, the whole procurement and logistical supply chain, as David said, it's massively important and it won't go away. People need to eat, people need energy sources. Now, just as an opening point, I want to explain also as a matter of English law that we are not a fused profession. When you do a law degree, you decide whether you're going to become a barrister. I specialize mainly in pleading and court advocacy work, or whether you're going to, unless you're a tax lawyer, in which case even a tax barrister rarely goes to court, or you become a solicitor. Now, solicitors were tended to be known as people who didn't go to court and didn't do any advocacy, but that's not correct anymore because we do a lot of arbitration and a lot of us solicitors do our own advocacy and arbitration. And we've now got something called higher rights of audience, which I have. The difference between Gerard and I is that he's very much more at the front end of actually getting up on his feet and doing the really tough and demanding job, which is actually present your client's case, think on your feet, and deal with sometimes angry and irritable judges. Furthermore, I would never go into a court. I don't understand the court structure. I don't have the insider knowledge. I don't have a clerk who knows the judge's clerks and everything. That's a completely different theatre. And that's where Gerard is very different from myself. In terms of our law and how we apply it, we've got some similarities. So I wanted to know at the outset that in England, you're either a solicitor or you're a barrister. You get people like myself who are basically in the arbitration, litigation, project side of commodities, where we end up doing a lot of our own advocacy. We do our own submissions, we draft our own affidavits for clients, blah, blah, blah. Okay, without any more waffle from me, I think, Gerard, explain why you became a lawyer. Why did you become a lawyer?
Well, hello, Paul. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Aston, and everyone in Kazakhstan. I was there last July with Paul. Absolutely loved it. And we're very disappointed that we couldn't go there again in July, but we're very looking forward to being there next year in July, God willing. Can I just say this? I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I probably still don't, Paul, when I grow up. I was quite clever at school, but there was areas that I wasn't so good at. And my father was pretty avant-garde. He was a research chemist and at ICI. And he sent me for some assessment in the 70s, which is very normal now. But in when you apply for jobs, you have all these tests and everything. In those days, it was a bit off the moon. And basically, I set a whole lot of tests and we found out that my verbo reasoning was off the scale, but my mathematical ability was not so good. So they said in the 70s, this guy can be a barrister, an actor, a politician, or go into advertising and marketing. So I didn't do the politics, but I've done all the others. And I do a lot of barristerial work, but I also do a lot of public speaking. And I do a lot of acting professionally and voiceover work with agents. So the reason I became a lawyer is because I wanted to be either an actor or a barrister. And that allowed me to combine the two. And as I said, I do both now, well, pre-COVID and God willing, early next year, post-COVID, a lot of that now. So I became a barrister because I didn't really want to be a solicitor, although I completely agree with you, Paul, that things have changed. In my day, 30 years ago, barristers were barristers and solicitors were solicitors. And there was never the twine should really meet. Barristers couldn't go to solicitors' offices. It was against the code of conduct. Barristers couldn't have cards because we weren't allowed to advertise. Now you can see with these marketing that's going on, it's incredible, the change. So I wanted to go to court. I didn't really want to be behind a desk. And in my early days, all I did really was criminal work, family work, and personal injury work. And I was in court 4 days a week, sometimes 5 days a week. Even on Boxing Day, I used to go and do bail applications in the
Could I
magistrate.
just at that moment, could I just interject by clarifying that one of the things that has really changed is that the big magic circle law firms did not have litigation departments.
That's a
because
good point.
they didn't even know what the rules of the court were. And then
Yeah.
with the massive minority shareholder disputes, with disputes under corporate finance, with regulatory and compliance, they started to have proper litigation departments. Before that, they'd just send the papers to a barrister and say, advise. So the rise of the litigation solicitor also coincided with the rise of arbitration and international arbitration. So much so that when I joined my firm, Holman's, in the very late 80s, I was surprised to find that most of my colleagues were in fact barristers who were trained as barristers because they had good advocacy and written skills, and they decided to come across mainly because it's a very competitive theatre and it's very difficult to get chambers. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I think it is important. But one of the things I do want you to address, please, Gerard, is that I sit in awe when I sit behind counsel on big high court cases sometimes, and I see the amount of, I would be totally intimidated to stand up in the court. Well, maybe not now because I'm a little bit older and crustier and a bit more self-opinionated, but certainly when I was younger, the sheer terror of standing before, a court of appeal, a judge on a big case, the intensity of preparation and everything, the fear factor alone, I think, must be terrific. And of course, the amount of preparation you have to put in to be totally on top of it. How do you deal with that? Could you just explain?
Well, it's a really interesting point, Paul. I hadn't really thought about it before. Put it this way, Paul, if a top QC doesn't have a little bit of fear, they need to retire. So when I go to court, there's still apprehension, still worry. Have I got it all right? Am I going to be all right? Will I sleep well tonight? All of those issues still go through my mind, and I think they always will. And I remember many, many years ago being led for 10 years on a trot by the great late Anthony Scrivener QC from my chambers. I remember going into the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court, to defend a train driver or whatever. And I remember in security, him pulling out all these lucky charms. And I said to him, hey, Scrivener, what are all those? He said, oh, those are my lucky charms. And I got all mine out and we had a laugh. So in the end of the day, the fear factor never goes away. The preparation never goes away. I mean, into the moment you rise to your feet, you're still preparing. And as I said, Paul, trying to be succinct so we can cut through a lot of stuff today, hopefully interesting to the students and others listening, and lawyers in Kazakhstan and elsewhere. The preparation will go on and on and on to the last minute. The day I don't feel any fear or anxiety, probably be the day I should give up. But, it's the same when you give big speeches. I did one last week to 7,000 people in Sydney, Australia, in aviation. And, you have a little apprehension even before you go on Zoom when you're dealing with that many people. But I find 7,000 easier than 7. I think speaking to a small audience, in my opinion, is harder than a big one. But that's just me.
Well, I agree. And one of the things that I teach the younger associates in my firm is that they seem to have this mentality that a B+ is good enough. It's not. It's either right or it's wrong. You're either pregnant or you're not. B+ is not good enough. And I have to say to them, look, I'm sorry, you're not at university now. You're not trying to impress me with getting 70%. It has to be 100%. Go away. I don't mind if you take more time. Don't sacrifice efficiency and excellence. Don't sacrifice excellence for efficiency. Maybe you can't charge the client because you've had to spend so long researching it, or I've had to, but you have to do that. And for me, again, if I'm preparing for a meeting, just even preparing to put out a capacity statement to try and get some work, it's all in the preparation. And I think that's something we share. You did mention that case involving the train driver, and I want to swing this back a little bit more to transport. That was a fascinating story that you told me about. I wonder if you just share that. It's the Paddington railway disaster, isn't it, that you're referring to?
In fact, probably not that one with Scribner. I mean, coming back to railways, Paul, you kindly mentioned it. I mean, I actually started in the first railway cases in about 1996, and I did all of the railway disasters. I did Eastcote, Watford, Southall, which was a intercities train, 7 died. I did Paddington for the dead driver, the public inquiry before Lord Cullen that went on for 9 months, that changed rail safety in this country and probably around the world forever. I did the Hatfield train crash on behalf of Balfour Beatty. I basically have done T-Bay. I've done virtually all the big railway crashes. And I remember saying after Hatfield, I don't want to do any more. And there haven't really been any since then, because I did 15 years in a row of railway crashes.
But Gerard, just moving on from there, you've actually carved out for yourself a reputation as being a catastrophic disaster lawyer, often representing the smaller person, you know, the train driver, or as in the Shoreham air crash, the innocent passers-by who were killed. And sometimes, you know, your career it's a bit like a ping pong ball. It just gets pushed into an orbit that you never really planned for. But you wouldn't have been as successful as you are had you not had a specific talent. And I'd like you just to explain briefly the role you have on public inquiries into disasters, but perhaps more importantly and more relevant for this audience is the lecturing you do on corporate risk management, not on building, on construction, on transport, to the aviation industry, because I think people would find that very interesting, because it was not something that was done either in the maritime area. The concept of corporate manslaughter was not something that featured until about 20 or 30 years ago.
Yes, Paul, thanks very much. I mean, you say ping pong ball. If you don't mind me saying, that's an excellent analogy. I mean, I actually wanted to do transport law because after my first degree, I did a master's in air and space law in the 80s, which was very, very rare. There was only about 3 places in the world that could do it. And I did it at UCL, where there was only 6 people in a year allowed. And I wanted to do air law. And then I got pushed around, bounced around the circles of life. And I went all around the houses. And since taking Silk 11 years ago, I've basically gone back to pure aviation and catastrophic risk. And basically, after the Watford train crash, I decided this is the area I really want to specialize in. And I started to write a lot about corporate negligence, corporate manslaughter. And then, frankly, 100 articles later, 4th edition of my book coming out next year, I've sort of, I suppose, if known for anything, I'm known for that. And I've worked in over 65 countries. So I've been very fortunate. Some of those I've been in work 30 or 40 times, Australia 20 times.
But a lot of your trips to Australia are actually to lecture to senior management of aviation companies. A lot of your work, I mean, could you just share a bit about what you're doing, and unless it's confidential, with the upgrading of the Houses of Parliament in England?
Well, I mean, I can't talk too much about it, but one of the things that I did mention in the beginning, Paul, is I do a lot of corporate acting. And what I mean by that is that sometimes I do cross-examining of real directors. Sometimes we use actors, and then I do a little speech. And, you know, I don't think it's in the public domain, that it is in the public domain, that the House of Commons, Palace of Westminster's renewal, which is, you know, you can go and look at it now, is going to be one of the biggest projects in the world and will take about 16, 17 years to complete. And last year, before COVID, I did a lot of work at the Palace of Westminster. We're using actors, where I did a speech, and then we had a drama scene where I cross-examined actors as if there'd been a death of a workman inside the project. And I have to be honest with you, it's been extremely well received. And my understanding is there's going to be loads more next year when it's safe to do so.
Well,
So that's
just because you frighten them all so much that they
No,
know they need more help.
not really, because I think often, Paul, they're very interested in what I say after the court scene, because then it really brings it home, not just the Palace of Westminster. I've been doing this for about 20 years. To rail companies, aviation companies, not just in the UK, but all over the world. And that's a nice mix for me, Paul, between the acting, the sort of drama, and the academic court work. And can I be honest with you, Paul, the loneliness of that massive preparation, sitting in your room or in your flat on a wet winter night, trying to sort of work out what you're going to say and what you need to learn and what you're going to leave to the juniors and all of that. So that's a nice offset to me. And I very greatly missed that since COVID, you know, where a personality
just a moment. I wanted to take you into COVID, but if you don't mind, I'd just like to say a little bit about myself and transport law.
Well, I was going to ask you, Paul, about things.
I know I'd sort of primed you to do so, but I'm going to go back to COVID later, because I think I'd like us both to deal with that at the same time.
Okay.
I just wanted to explain to people, I got into the law because I have a nomadic spirit. I was born abroad. I'm a third generation born abroad, certainly on my mother's side of the family. And I frankly, I won't tell you why I did law, probably because I was a humanist and not very good at anything else. I do think you have to have empathy with people, because you have to speak to people, you have to manage people, you have to manage their expectations. It's not surprising that a lot of lawyers are very good at acting, are very comfortable with being in crowds and speaking to people, mildly gregarious. Also, I think lawyers suffer from high rates of alcoholism and other problems as well, as do some of the professionals. But I got into it because I wanted to travel. And at that time, in the early 80s, it was very difficult to be a lawyer and travel. That's changed, of course. And a firm like mine, which when I joined it had an office in Paris, now has 15 offices all over the world. And I was responsible or given the opportunity over 30 years ago to set up the Singapore office. And I've also had previously worked in our Hong Kong office. I've spent 4 years in Shanghai. And I've been in London for over 12 years, and now I'm back in Singapore and have been here for nearly 10 years. So I've had a wonderful life of travel, and that has taken me to places like the Andaman Islands on a ship that caught fire. It's taken me to an island offshore Darwin, where an FPSO, a floating production facility, was damaged in some way. I have been to so many interesting places and met so many interesting people, and I've also had the ability to interview, to work with numerous experts in all sorts of different disciplines, such as metallurgical experts, moisture migration experts, naval architects, so many different types, engineers of all types, different lawyers of all types. So for me, it was the fact that I love history, I love geography, I love travel, and I'm interested in people. For me, when I go somewhere, I always read up about it if I don't know about it. And that's really one of the reasons why I went into the law. But I have learned to love the law. I have learned to love the beauty of the English language, the way that really good judges and barristers and lawyers can explain very difficult issues in a very succinct and very compelling way, how they can write in a very compelling way. More and more advocacy is becoming oral advocacy, and the use and the mastering of the language, certainly in a common law as opposed to a civil jurisdiction, is absolutely imperative. And it is a skill and it's a pleasure. So for me, it was that. And then it's the fact that I'm not particularly numerate, but I do find basic engineering concepts quite interesting. And to be able to understand, I mean, I did study, you said you studied aeronautical law. I went back to Dundee University Centre of Mineral Law and Policy and spent my 2 summer holidays and a bit of my part-time for 2 years studying really exploration and production offshore, along rubbing shoulders with geologists and petroleum scientists. And I learnt the jargon and I learnt about resource development. And I think it's absolutely fascinating in the same way that you find it fascinating that a plane can fly so high and fly as it does. I find it fascinating how people can extract minerals from the earth, but more importantly, how they can extract at the same level, 33,000 feet below the ground, all sorts of different hydrocarbons. And to see that equipment, to try and understand the design and how the law is involved in the allocation of risk of those major projects is fascinating. So that's kind of like how I got into the law. Why did I get into shipping? Well, to be honest, 85% of everything that's carried is still carried on ships. And it just so happened that there was a selection of shipping law firms, and I was attracted to that, and I wasn't so much attracted to the corporate work. I might have been a lot wealthier if I'd gone into the corporate world, but maybe I wouldn't have been as successful. So I just wanted to say that by way of background. I would also add that you also get to understand about different jurisdictions. So you gain an understanding of comparative law. So it's totally international transport and trade is totally outward facing from the UK. It brings you out of yourself. It gives you an awareness of different people, different cultures. Negotiation is absolutely imperative. And you've got to understand cultural differences if you're going to negotiate successfully. I'm a mediator and I'm also an arbitrator. I tend not to do so much of that because I practice law, but at some stage in my life, I hope to do much more of that, particularly mediation. And one of the things that's very interesting about mediation is lawyers are beginning to understand, and other professionals in mediation, that if you really want to be successful, you've got to understand about brain science and psychology. But I would go so far as to say that if you want to really be good at negotiations, which is a very important part of any lawyer's job, you've got to take time out and study brain science, not body language, brain science and elementary psychology. So it really is a wonderfully challenging way forward. Now, what I'd like to deal with now, my good friend, is the challenges to the lawyers going forward. And then after that, if we can make a few comments about COVID and how that's impacted and will. And then I think we'll take questions. But first of all, what do you see the challenges for, particularly with regard to barristers? And then if I may, I'll talk about solicitors and private practice.
Well, Paul, before I just do that, can I just say I completely endorse what you said, because like you, and you mentioned in the introduction, I grew up in South America, Malta, Singapore, Manila, Bangkok, and Hong Kong. So I wanted to travel, which is probably another reason why I wanted to do aviation and catastrophic work. And I'm sure I'm not 100% right about this, but I don't know how many QCs in London have worked in 65 countries. And the most remote, there might be a few, but a handful. So I've been very, very fortunate. And one of my weirdest experiences was traveling all the way to South Georgia in Antarctica for a 7-hour site visit in one of the most remote places on Earth, and then traveling back. And for that 7 hours, that took just over 3.5 weeks. So I've been really, really fortunate, like you, Paul. Coming back to the barristers, that is quite depressing, I'm afraid, because every week on a Wednesday, Paul, I sit on a head of chambers call with between 20 and 50 sets of chambers and heads of chambers. And things are quite depressing because, of course, I know we don't want to mention the C word, the COVID word, but it's only very recently in the last month that big trials have started again. and they're already beginning to be shut down. There's a big public inquiry in Manchester into the Manchester Arena bombing, and I see yesterday they've closed it till Monday because of COVID, and who knows how long it'll be shut. So a lot of the barristers haven't really worked, Paul, since March or April. And there's going to be huge casualty from this. The recent poll that I've got from July said that between 23 and 37% of barristers in the Southeast Circuit round London will not be renewing their practicing certificate in March or April. And the more lockdowns we have, the longer this goes on, the higher the chance that that will happen, or maybe even worse. I've been a little more fortunate. My problem next year, Paul, is going to be trying to fit basically 6 or 7 months of this year into next year on top of everything else that I've got. And that will have its own challenges. But sadly, 20, 30, maybe even more % of the practicing bar in the Southeast Circuit, I don't know about the Northern Circuits of England, will not be renewing their practicing certificate. They haven't really earned any money since March, and they've had all their overheads.
I think, Gerard, what you're talking about is the effects of COVID, and it's very depressing for the barristers, and that's because they are self-employed effectively, whereas we've been perhaps a bit more ring-fenced. I mean, I think before COVID came, I was always of the view that, and please, some of you may not like hearing this, but there are some lawyers who think that they're really businessmen and all they have to do is massage clients and they will have a good business, and then the younger lawyers can just do the work. That might be the case in certain areas of law, but in the sort of international arbitration dispute resolution projects, whilst it's absolutely imperative to know how to delegate properly and to manage a team, and I would like to say I'm recognized as being somebody who can really manage a team. For me, I'm a lawyer and I want to be doing the law, and I want to be on top of the cases. And I tell my associates, and you've got to know the case law. You've got to keep looking at the case law. We never get an easy case. Nothing is exactly the same as anything else. We're always in this gray area. The excellence of the law is absolutely what you have to be doing. And personally, I can't go anywhere without my laptop. I can't do my work on a BlackBerry. And I defy anybody to do that, because all you're doing is just knocking back emails and massaging clients, and that's not good enough. So the areas of law that I deal with, transport law and project law and construction areas, do require you to actually do the law. And that means you have to sit down, and it's wonderful to have concepts like Team and Zoom and Skype, because you can easily contact one of your colleagues and talk. So far as COVID is concerned, and I think that was a challenge to lawyers before, because I think some lawyers didn't really take on board the need to constantly excel and improve themselves. They just kind of felt they had an entitlement just to have a career for life, and that's just wrong. And my second point, that even before COVID, lawyers were having to give up things like family law, domestic conveyancing, really the stuff that paralegals can do, the stuff that artificial intelligence can do. But artificial intelligence can't cross-examine a witness. Artificial intelligence cannot turn around when a judge says, well, why do you say that, Mr. Forlin? I disagree with you. And step back and say, my lord, you're perfectly entitled to disagree with me, if you must. It's just, there are certain things about the high end of the law that were not threatened by artificial intelligence. Whereas, anyone who wants to make a career out of due diligence in corporate work, you're the first to go, because you can't process as fast as a multi-computer. Now, I say all this out of controversy, so I hope somebody will come back and prove me wrong. So I think we're constantly, it's a bit like the oil majors. They used to have a concession and they'd just do everything. But more and more, the host sovereign company is making them go to the higher end of the petroleum industry, from oil to gas and then to deep sea exploration, whatever. And I think with the lawyers, we should be pushed into these more interesting areas where we can truly add value. So far as COVID is concerned, it's very interesting, and it's not just my firm, but certainly in maritime trade and international transport shipping, we're up on last year. We're doing okay because the volatility of the oil price and commodity prices makes people do stupid things. They take risks because they think they can make money. It doesn't actually matter whether the oil price is high or low. The question is they can gamble on it, and they start doing things like buying masses of oil to store and then not having storage capacity. So that's created volatility. But on the other hand, obviously, projects, financing projects, energy and resources, and of course aviation are lower. So there's been a sort of, we're almost a little bit recession proof, because unlike the barristers, we have a number of different departments. When A is not doing so well, B is doing okay. But I think that unfortunately is going to mean that you're going to get more and more larger firms and lower small firms or bespoke firms, unless they somehow morph into Deloitte's or something like that, is what you're doing. So I think the pressures also on private practice is that the big insurance companies, the accountants, the third-party funders, they're all taking lawyers. A lot of younger lawyers now want to be in-house. It's safer. They don't have to work so hard. It's not as they can plan. They want to come into private practice and then jump ship to in-house. We're constantly threatened on our fees. We're constantly being asked to have capped fees, even for litigation work. Clients pay the lawyers last. It is a bit of a perfect storm, but if you're good enough and if you're passionate enough, when there's a big problem, the client wants you and needs you, and you're in that same area. So I think being in an area where when the mud hits the fan, what they need you, they don't care how much you cost, they don't care how much time you've got to spend. COVID has taught us that we don't have to fall over just because we can't travel. There have been a number of successful arbitrations, mediations conducted remotely. We've all become so much better at using Zoom, webinars and such like. And I think that's cutting costs. I think it's making us more efficient. And I think that will continue. So I think there's some very good things that have come out of it. Funnily enough, I don't see the aviation industry has been hammered by COVID, but the shipping industry, not so much, although the seafarers have suffered because they have been locked up in ports, they can't get home. They've really suffered, and there's a lot of good charitable work. I'm an ambassador for seafarers here in Singapore, and we're doing quite a lot of work to help them. But the actual amount of ships coming in and out, now that China has started to produce again, is going upward. So that's just what I wanted to say about COVID and the things that are happening in the industry. And maybe, unless you've got something you'd like to mention, Gerard, maybe we could invite Dastan to see if there's any questions.
Just yes, before we do that, Paul, just to say I agree with that. The problem is, Paul, that the critical areas like criminal work, family work, personal injury work, are particularly at the bar, those skills that have been built up over literally hundreds of years. The problem with COVID is it's going to cull the publicly funded sector when the countries around the world, I mean, I'm admitted in Australia and the British Virgin Islands, coming back to what you said earlier about English law being the root, is going to be gone forever just when these countries need those experienced lawyers the most. That's the real problem. Criminal law, prosecuting, defending, divorce work, family work, children custody. That's the real crying shame of what's going to happen with COVID, not the big law firms. So just wanted to say that. And I agree, Paul. Dastan, is there any questions from the people out there? Paul and I would be delighted to try and answer them if we can. Hello?
Yes, Almas, do we have any questions that have come in by the chat or any hand raising?
Sure, if I may. Let me start, please, with some questions. First question is from our legal tech professional, from Almas. He is asking, how is the transport sector keeping up with technology? Will technology impact the law in this area?
Very much so. Just in shipping, there has been a lot of work done on non-man operated vessels. Now, that's not going to happen with petroleum tankers or tankers or any vessel carrying highly explosive or dangerous cargo. But you can readily appreciate that for container vessels, bulk shipments, remote operated vessels are a thing not of the future. They're already testing them now. So that will mean less jobs on the ship for the seamen, but much more jobs in technology ashore, monitoring and such like. So that's something I'd like to mention. Maybe Gerard would have a view about that in aviation. Yeah. Certainly another sorry, Gerard, another area where technology is so important is we had a webinar with the AIFC on rail transportation and actually rail cargo transportation, and particularly from east to west, from West China through to Europe. And there are many routes. There's about 20 routes at the moment, some going through Russia, a lot going through Kazakhstan. And one of the challenges for Kazakhstan to improve the time, and can I just say, it used to take 30 days for a train in the early 2000s to get from West China to Europe. It now takes about 11. It should actually only take about 3 or 4. And one of the reasons that could be improved if there was better technology on the rail lines and if there was more compatibility between the countries. So, for example, electrification of railway lines. We've seen one of the great advantages in rail traffic, particularly when you're going through so many different environmental and climatic zones, is having temperature balanced, temperature controlled containers on board rail trucks so that the goods do not suffer, electronic goods, whatever they may be, from differences in temperatures. Also, technology is going to play a huge role, and we don't have time to talk about it, in cyber, and maybe that's what you were going to mention, in cyber terrorism, but also in immigration, speeding up immigration and immigration controls. Artificial intelligence has got a lot to do with that. You just have to think about eye and fingerprint technology. So I think on not having electronic documentation, encrypted documents, immigration particularly, and actually infrastructure, technology is great because everybody wants just in time. The more time you spend storing goods, the more expensive it becomes. So if you know that you can get something from the west of China into Hamburg in 5 days, then it cuts down all your storage costs and everything. And it doesn't matter that you may have to pay a little bit more on a faster train. Gerard.
Yeah, and for example, there's so many things. Just mentioning the COVID word for a second, it's important people may know that yesterday the first flights were leaving Heathrow, going to Hong Kong, whereby you could have your COVID test that was at Heathrow that was acceptable by the Hong Kong authorities. That is going to progress faster and faster. You may have heard overnight, Oxford is now 100%, they've got a vaccine. We will have a vaccine unveiling into care workers in England first. British are going to get it first before Christmas, with it being unveiled through to July. Anyone over 50 getting it before July next year. Oxford have got a vaccine now that's working. And then in terms of aviation, you've got massive ramping up of drones in Australia, in Canberra. Already you can get your coffee delivered to your office. That's going to expand massively around the world. Biotechnology, fuel, much more efficient aircraft. There will come a time in my lifetime and Paul's lifetime, and we're not exactly in the first blush of youth, where you have pilotless aircraft. That's definitely going to happen. So technology all round is going to have massive impacts. It may have a price in terms of employment. There may be less people employed, but of course, and we haven't got time to get into this, there are massive environmental issues as well, because everyone is focused on COVID. But the real elephant in the room is climate change, which we haven't got time to get into today. And that technology and biotechnology will perhaps give the world a few more extra years. And that's obviously very, very important too. So it's a great question, whoever answered it. Sorry if we can't spend too much time answering it. We could do a whole webinar just on that.
Absolutely. Dastan, Almas?
No, yeah, thank you very much for your answers. So next question is, Kazakhstan is a key transit point in the new Silk Road. What does it mean for lawyers, in particular transport lawyers? For example, what kinds of transactions or projects do you foresee?
Well, as I say, we had a very interesting discussion on logistics, and there were some very good people on that. I forget when that was. I think it was in
July?
May, or was it July? Yeah. And logistics is becoming a very big thing in transportation. One gentleman, I've forgotten his name, but he was an absolute expert, was explaining how there are basically 4 or 5 different methods of transportation, and you can utilize them all. You can mix them up. You could, for example, take a product by train to Almaty and then drive it by truck to somewhere else, and then put it on an aircraft to Turkey and then take it by train or truck to somewhere else. Mixing and matching transportation modes are very important. However, for every good that's transported, however it's transported, you need a document of title, you need a document that's negotiable, or you need at least a document that shows who owns that. So we get things such as through bills of lading, seaway bills of lading, standard bills of lading, freight forwarders, NVOCCs. So the documentation is there. One of the big problems that nobody's cracked yet is how to have electronic bills of lading, because there was a case involving Rotterdam where unfortunately the electronic documentation was hacked into by scammers, and they were able to get hold of the cargo, and the court held that it wasn't the ship owner's fault that he gave, or the port's fault that they gave discharge to the wrong people. They didn't guarantee this system, so they're still back to the old bill of lading, unlocking of the keys of the warehouse. Obviously projects, this is linked to the technology issue. Construction lawyers, very important, big construction projects, particularly railways, roads, dredging, bridges, drainage. The plant and equipment that is required to do those projects is not always in country. Obviously, the Chinese contractors have a head start because most of the finance is coming from the banks from China, and they favor the Chinese constructors, and you see people like Chinese Construction Company Limited. But this whole area is so integrated. You may be surprised to know that a company like China Construction Company Limited has over 200 vessels, owns 200 vessels, and these are actually supply plant, supply barges and kit to assist in dredging and other portside operations. So it's not really deep sea. But in order to run those vessels and the ones that they charter, they buy a huge, I think it's like 500 million tons of bunkers, i.e. marine diesel, marine gas a year. So they had a joint venture with an oil company, which unfortunately went bust in Singapore recently. So I'm just giving that as an example of how everything's so integrated. But I would say certainly the infrastructure, the technology to improve the infrastructure, and also the novel innovations in terms of logistics and just how to get stuff there on time, quickly, and at the cheapest cost.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with all of that. Construction, rail, road, and of course, air. And I've had the privilege and pleasure of being on Air Astana, excellent airline. I mean, because of the geo situation of Kazakhstan, right in the middle there, right in the middle of the time zones, India, China, Europe, the Middle East, I see and foresee a massive expansion of aviation, both internally and internationally, from Kazakhstan in the very near future. And I think it needs to happen. And I would love to be involved in trying to help that on its way, if I can, in any way I possibly can, to help Kazakhstan in its aviation. Massive advantages Kazakhstan's got. There's time now to implement and use those. And I see that as very much, COVID will pass. We can't live a whole life thinking about COVID. In a few months, we'll have a flu jab and a COVID jab every year. And that's what it'll be until the next one. So we've got to try and think past COVID. And I think the expansion of the aviation industry in and out of Kazakhstan is going to be the next major project for Kazakhstan. In my humble opinion, it should be. And I'm very excited about that prospect.
Good. Thank you, Gerard. Could I just make another comment here? Given the AIFC and the advantage of being able to raise, because of course we haven't talked about the financing of these projects and innovations and improvements, and maybe that's for fintech lawyers or corporate lawyers, corporate finance lawyers. But obviously Kazakhstan, well, certainly Astana or Nur-Sultan is very, very attractive. And if I was a major transport logistical operator, I would think, well, I'd probably have a base in Hong Kong or Singapore or both, but probably maybe just one of those. I would want a base somewhere in the middle, and I would be looking at either the Middle East, MENA countries, or I'd be looking at Kazakhstan. And I think, for reasons I don't have time to say, I actually think, why not Kazakhstan? Why not Nur-Sultan? Because I think it has certain advantages over the Middle East, many advantages. And the way that the exchange is going, the way the AIFC is going, it's soon going to be, I hope, very attractive for people to set up there. In terms of accessibility, we need to have more flights going in and out. That needs to happen. But I think there's so many attractive reasons, if you're in logistics and transport, to be based, have at least one of your offices based in Nur-Sultan.
I agree.
Yes, thank you. I see here two questions. Meaning of both is the same, but I guess from different angles. First question is, what are the qualities one should have in order to become a successful lawyer? Also, in terms of transport law, what kind of knowledge one should have in order to excel in the role? And the second point is, what are the primary features of the best transportation lawyer? What should I pay attention to when searching for professional?
Look, very, very simply, always expect the unexpected. Don't be frightened of change, embrace it. But I think most importantly, be passionate. Be passionate about the sectors. Transportation is geopolitical. If you're not interested in what's going on in the world, if you're not interested in people and their cultures, if you're not up to date with what your client is doing, you know, if you've got a mining client or an aviation client or a railway client, you know, you owe him the respect to actually go and research about it. We've got Google. Go out there and find out as much as you can about his sector so that you don't ask him stupid questions, that you understand what his concerns are. And don't make the mistake that so many lawyers make across the board, which is they go to meet clients and they sit there and they just tell clients how good they are and what they can do and what they do. Go and say, I want to hear what your company's doing. I read that you're setting up a new branch there. Tell me about the challenges. Is there any way I can help you? Listen to your client and try and understand his business. But most importantly, understand the sector in which he's operating. You'll only ever be a dilettante. He'll always know more than you, but that's no excuse not to try and understand his sector. And of course, if you're passionate in that area, go for it. I'm hopeless at numbers. I'd have made a lousy accountant. I'd have made a lousy tax lawyer, which is why I'm not doing it. My passions lie elsewhere, and they seem to have aligned with the law that I do. I love nothing more than putting on a boiler suit and going into a shipyard and walking around the latest semi-submersible or getting on board a ship. I mean, it's just so much fun. Other people hate it. Other people hate talking to experts. They'd rather have their head in a book of tax law. That's not for me, but I respect that they're at least passionate about it.
Yeah, I agree, but trying not to repeat that. I think being interested in cultures, speaking other languages is quite important. I'm half Irish, half Italian, and I speak Italian, French, and I use that a lot. For example, something that Paul touched on in my game, if you can't understand it, how can you explain that to a judge and or a jury? And to be able to understand something well, you've got to be able to explain it simply. And so you really have to immerse yourself in the jargon, the culture, and the industry. On top of that, you have to be adaptable. You know, this is the kind of global work where sometimes Paul and I may need to speak on a Sunday afternoon. Not all the time, but we may have to do that. You've got to be ready with the world and the time differences, cultures, to really understand that that is sometimes required. Not all the time, because we all need our work-life balance, but you've got to be able to say, oh, yeah, I'll take that call if you really need to, because you've got to work to the client, not the other way around. The days you start to think you're more important than the client, you haven't got many more days left as a lawyer. So it's really being impassioned about it. I agree with Paul. I love aircraft. I love people. I love cultures, because right from the beginning, Paul and I have had an upbringing that's unusual for British lawyers. We've grown up in foreign climes, and I'm so privileged and lucky to have done that. And it has changed the way I think. And I do think can do, not, oh, no, can't do, not can't do. So I think it's really, really important. But I don't want to sort of go over the same points Paul did.
Well, I'll just say that I always regard myself as a high-class butler. High class only because I chant quite a lot. But we are in the service industry, and we must never, ever forget that. We are there to serve our clients within the rules of our profession. Sometimes that's a challenge, but that's another story. I think we've kind of exceeded our limit, but I'm very happy to continue.
Oh, yeah.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, we thanked Paul and Gerard. We have two more questions that we'd like to try to cover. So if people don't mind staying on for a couple minutes, and if Paul and Gerard, if you're okay, why don't we give those a go and then we'll finish up.
Okay.
Great. Go ahead, Almas.
Thank you, David. Next question is, transport sector is notoriously famous for being not environmentally friendly. Is the sector doing anything to address this issue? Is there anything the AIFC, for example, AIFC Green Finance, can help?
Well, Gerard, if you don't mind, I'll go first there. I mean, I think that shipping and ships get a really bad rap. There's more environmental damage done to the world by the fashion industry than by the shipping industry. It's always very easy to attack the shipping industry because it's not particularly well regulated, but because, you know, you've got pictures of poor old penguins covered in oil and everything. And I know it looks bad, but really just the day-to-day pollution that is land-based, the stuff that goes from factories into rivers and in developed countries, the amount of dumping of waste from developed countries to underdeveloped countries, the lack of regulation, the lack of corruption onshore is far worse. The ship is a floating target. It's a big asset. It can be arrested in most jurisdictions. It moves around, and the poor ship owner needs some pretty impressive cover. Most ships have over over $500 million worth of insurance for pollution. They have a separate convention that deals with hazardous and toxic goods. They have the IMDG code, which deals with dangerous cargoes and which cargoes can be loaded next to others. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it gets a very bad rap. And because it's just so visual, it's so visceral when something happens, and people get very upset when they jump into the sea and they get covered in oil. But seriously, I mean, there have been some cases where fuel oil, which evaporates very quickly, has been discharged, and there's been a big hoo-ha about poor old penguins and whatever. Look, I'm repeating myself. Funnily enough, the most environmentally unfriendly form of transport is trucks, diesel trucks. So we should be able, surely, to address that. So far as green finance is concerned, I'm not really expert to talk on that, but I can readily see that with subsidies from governments or people being able to raise finance at a cheaper rate because they're going to try and invest in more green products, that's obviously going to be very, very important. Having said that, we've seen a lot of hypocrisy in the trade finance banks. The trade finance banks are not sponsoring, are not financing sugar. Some of them are getting out of all sorts of really normal commodities that people need because they want to appear green. Actually, they just don't want to be involved in the trades that require a lot of back office and compliance and do perhaps have a reputation. They'd rather do oil and gas and finance that. So really, I think it's, trade finance banks really need to look at themselves. And also the oil companies, I mean, they're always, the first thing you see when you walk into the reception room of an oil company, you'd think you're walking into a zoo. There's pictures of beautiful animals and greenery and whatever, and yet, really that's not what they're doing. So I think people have to be a little bit more responsible about how they advertise. But I would say it certainly is much better than it was. And I think shipping is very regulated on the environmental front. We've got the reduction in carbon emissions. There are engines will be phased out by 2020. We have, as I say, sulfur emissions restrictions and all sorts of things being done there. I'd like to see the same intensity applied to other areas of the transport sector.
Yeah, and I've already touched on aviation. I don't want to repeat that. All the biotechnology, the new aircraft, the modern aircraft. I mean, one of the casualties of COVID has been the retirement of the 747s because they're just too fuel hungry and too big. The A380s are hardly not flying at the moment, but the aircraft that are flying are all modern and very fuel efficient. Biotechnology is definitely coming. It's already started with Qantas and a number of other airlines. That's going to accelerate. And the thing that we haven't mentioned is rail. Of course, I've spent basically half a career dealing with the aftermath of the rail crashes, especially a bit embarrassing for British people as the inventors of the modern railway. We became the world expert at crashing them for a period in the 80s and 90s and 2000s, early 2000s. But rail is a relatively fuel efficient in terms of pollution damage. And that's another factor that we've mentioned. Kazakhstan is perfectly placed to boost their rail from Asia to the West. And with a modern aircraft, yes, transport has a place to play, a place to be in helping on the climate change. And I'm sorry, I don't actually ask for forgiveness to repeat what I said. The climate change issue is the biggest issue in the game at the moment in the world. I just want to add with one last thing. Last week, the biggest news story was by far the German ship returning from the Arctic after a year. It went pre-COVID, it came back post-COVID. They've been away for a year. And what they found is that the Arctic sheet had reduced by over 50% since 1980 in 40 years. And they've said if that carries on, COVID will be the least of our problems. So we really do need to address this. And I agree with Paul. A number of the carbon trading schemes have been open to massive corruption and fraud. And there's been a lot of trials all over the world in relation to trading of carbon trade-offs being corruptly dealt with. And there will be more and more of that. We really need to take this seriously, guys, because frankly, from my college at Cambridge, Professor Hawkins said 3 years ago, before he died, the world has less than 30 years to either go underground or find a new planet as things currently are. And he said that way before COVID, and he mentioned pestilence and plague because we're overcrowded. So we need to get this sorted, otherwise it's game over. Sorry to end on a negative note, but I do know a little bit about this. So it's a great question. Rail, better aircraft, ships, as Paul said, better pollution control has got to be absolute priority. Thank you very much. Sorry to end in a...
No, that's okay.
Second question.
Have a nice weekend.
Yeah, we can go with one more question. Hey, look, this is a fireside chat, and it's great to get a diversity of opinions from knowledgeable people who have reflected on these subjects. So this is what it's all about. So thanks to both of you for your candor. Almas, let's go with one last question, and away we go.
Yeah, the last one. Do you often handle transport accident cases? What types of results have you obtained for your clients? And how long does it generally take to resolve such cases?
Look, Gerard has already mentioned his experience with railway disasters, so we're not going to ask him to repeat that. I work for a firm that is, if not the Manchester United of shipping, is the Manchester City or the Liverpool. It has a reputation for being excellent in maritime, but even in maritime, we distinguish between what we call admiralty, which is pure collisions, and groundings, and pollution, and fires on ships, as opposed to the rest of the business, which is by far and away the most important, which is charter parties, bills of lading, building ships, ports, everything to do with the maritime world, offshore energy. We've been involved in some of the biggest collisions and disasters. There are conventions. When two ships collide, there is not a contractual dispute. There is no agreed forum. It is a tort. It normally happens in international waters. So forum shopping and jurisdiction agreements become very, very important. But actually, maritime lawyers are normally able to sit down, preferably over a glass of beer or wine, and sort out with their opponents an apportionment of liability. And then everything flows from that. And then it's a question of all the insured risks. There are limitation conventions which come into play. So normally within a year, we can resolve a collision. In many other cases, it takes longer than that because you're dependent on the court's time. Very few collision cases actually go to the court. But I have been involved in fires, capsizing, explosions. I act for a very big shipyard in Singapore that has subsidiaries in the Philippines, Vietnam, and various other places. And I have investigated deaths of yard workers because of explosions whilst undertaking heat work on board a vessel that's in for particularly passenger ferries, which are difficult vessels, which are undergoing repairs and renovation. And really, you're like Inspector Clouseau. You're an investigator with a fire or explosions expert, and you're trying to work out what happened, and then you're trying to work out the damages and the liabilities, and it's all insured, so you've got to deal with the insurers. Often these casualties provoke, and Gerard can speak more about this, but they provoke so much interest in the press, particularly where local nationals are killed. And often the press reporting, if you're acting for a public listed company, it can have a huge effect on its share price. And then in addition to trying to handle the case, working under extreme conditions, sometimes in not very comfortable areas, sometimes sleeping on board a ship or in a shipyard in some place that's not particularly convenient, you're getting pressure from the board of directors of a public listed company that their price of their shares has fallen, and can you please wrap it up quickly and move on? So they are very interesting cases, and it's a privilege to have been involved in them. Gerard?
Yes, I agree, Paul. I mean, I think it's just for the lawyers and the younger lawyers on the call. I think it's important to remember, I mean, I've done a lot of ship deaths as well, ships of sailors dying at sea, going overboard, all the way to dockyard explosions and deaths on the docks, etc. So I've done quite a lot of what we would call wet shipping, I suppose, rather than dry shipping. But I've done a couple of collisions at sea, but where pollution issues arise in the civil and criminal courts. But the reason I've mentioned that is because it's very important to remember when something happens on board a ship or on board a plane or an oil rig or a rail yard or a rail track, you will have civil litigation, insurance litigation, you'll have criminal litigation, you'll have an inquest, so you'll have something looking into who died and when they died, where they died and how they died. You could have disciplinary issues, you could have trade union issues, and they're all going on at the same time. And I tend at my stage to handle all of it. So these things can take a long, long time. One of the cases I remember, which is slightly different, where a young Polish banker died in a lift in a gym in the central part of London. And I was acting for ThyssenKrupp, who were the German lift manufacturers. I was involved in all of that. And from the tragic death in the lift of this young Polish banker to the final inquest was about 10 or 11 years. Now that is a little longer than average, but I would say these cases take 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years on average, dealing with all the aspects that I've just mentioned. It's not just the criminal or the civil, all of them. So it really depends, but they don't end quickly in my experience. Sometimes they do, but that's the civil case. The criminal stuff takes a lot longer. As simple as that. Inquest takes even longer sometimes. I'm delighted
to know that traveling in a lift counts as transport law.
Well, technically it does, yeah. There's a lot of lift deaths. I've done a lot of lift deaths. I've done over 10.
A lot of lift deaths on maintenance of lifts at sea, when people unfortunately are half in, half out of a lift when it's meant to be cut off, and somebody in the engine room just flicks a switch, and very gruesome deaths. Yeah, indeed. Anyway, we could go on and on with stories about how people die at sea, but I won't bore you with that.
Right. Well, Paul and Gerard, we want to thank you so much, wholeheartedly, on behalf of the Academy. You guys have been fabulous in this event, and I have to say, you're welcome to return to this Academy of Law Learning and Development platform whenever you please. As you all were interacting during this session, I was thinking, we should come up with maybe a 6-hour version, a certificate program in maritime and transportation, but that's a discussion for another day. And to our audience, I see that most of you have stayed on this call, even though we've run 20 minutes beyond our allotted time. And we really appreciate that. That tells me that, confirms for me what I think I already knew, which is this is a very relevant, dynamic, developing sector, and it has multiple aspects to it. So this is fascinating. I'd like to encourage our participants on this call today to feel free to reach out directly to Paul Aston or Gerard Forlin, or both. If you have a question, would like some clarification, if you need any support or advice on matters that you might be working on relative to your own companies or to your clients, please feel free. That's what this is all about. And what I find most remarkable about events like this is we have such experienced and knowledgeable lawyers and barristers who have joined us here on today's call. These guys are not only fabulous lawyers and advocates, but they also have hearts that are in the right place. And I think to bring this humanistic side to things and to look at the big picture as to where we are in Central Asia in the development of infrastructure like Kazakhstan, you have to have the right mindset. You have to be enthusiastic about it. And you have to look at what's in the best interests of the public good. And I think that's a key part of what we're doing here. At the end of the day, these are our jobs, but these are our jobs for a reason. It's because we love it. We're passionate about it. And we believe in our ability to maybe make some contribution into the grander scheme of global economic development and the ongoing improvement of geopolitical relations. So with that, thanks to everyone. Have a great evening. Have a terrific weekend. Stay safe. And we hope to see you all again soon. Paul and Gerard, thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you very
Bye,
much,
everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.